Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. I trust you had a great weekend. It's been rather cold again here in Nairobi. We've hardly had any summer whatsoever. Political reflections: Jair Bolsonaro, far-right populist, dubbed the Trump of the Tropics, wins Brazil's presidential election. Next funds IBOVESPA ETF jumps 13% in Japan after Bolsonaro win. So look, it was widely expected, but he clearly is the Trump mold. That's why he's called Trump of the Tropics, and he's got some pretty extreme perspectives. It's going to be interesting to see how this develops. Now, as in Sri Lanka, massive plot twist. China's ambassador to Sri Lanka, Cheng Xueyuan, called on newly appointed Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa earlier today to convey congratulatory wishes from Chinese President Xi Jinping. And this is a proxy war between China and India. Rajapaksa very much in the Chinese camp. And here we see China reversing India's gain. There was drama in Colombo on Friday with the president calling on Prime Minister Wickremesinghe to step down and hand power to former leader Mahinda Rajapaksa. But the Prime Minister was still refusing to stand down on Saturday. Bloomberg is talking about the shift towards China. Sri Lanka's political crisis is deepening. A leadership struggle in Sri Lanka is the latest skirmish in the broader battle for influence in South Asia between India and China, and has left the tiny island nation, already heavily indebted to Beijing, the Hambantota story, in the midst of an escalating constitutional crisis. Sri Lankan President Sirisena unexpectedly dismissed Prime Minister Wickremesinghe on Friday and appointed former strongman President Mahinda Rajapaksa as his replacement. Rajapaksa ruled between 2005 and 2015, and it's expected to have a regional impact with his ties to China and the history of borrowing heavily from Beijing to fund infrastructure projects. China is once again emerging as Colombo's last hope, said Shailesh Kumar. And these developments play into the broader rivalry between India and China. You'll recall that India's candidate took the prize in the Maldives just a few weeks ago. Sri Lanka's 2028 bonds fall 1.6 cents, most since they were sold in April. Xi Jinping says prepare for war. He tells the military region that monitors the South China Sea and Taiwan. China must take all complex situations into consideration and make emergency plans accordingly, Xi says on a visit to the Southern Theatre Command. The military region has had to bear a heavy military responsibility in recent years, he said. Ordered the military region responsible for monitoring the South China Sea and Taiwan to assess the situation it is facing and to boost its capabilities so it can handle any emergency. It's necessary to strengthen the mission and concentrate preparations for fighting a war. We need to take all complex situations into consideration and make emergency plans accordingly. Step up combat readiness exercises, joint exercises, and confrontational exercises to enhance servicemen's capabilities and preparation for war. Of course, earlier this month, a Chinese destroyer almost collided with the US warship Decatur in the disputed waters after making what the Americans described as an unsafe, unprofessional maneuver. The United States is expected to conduct more freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea region, and because it does not recognize Beijing's rights to artificial islands like Mischief Reef, there will probably be more military friction between the countries there. I wrote this piece talking about this exact issue. War is coming was the piece I wrote. Have a look at that. Netanyahu met with Sultan Qaboos in a surprise visit to Oman. Sultan Qaboos, of course, was the interlocutor between Barack Obama and Iran's Khamenei And therefore, in that context, this visit is extremely interesting. Adil Ajubair says Saudi Arabia has a strategic relationship with the US that goes back to the 1930s, and that was enshrined in a meeting between the late King Abdulaziz and the late Franklin Roosevelt. That relationship, he said, is ironclad. And as I said, the King of Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, serves at the pleasure of the President of the United States. That was agreed on February 1945, when Roosevelt met King Abdulaziz in person aboard the USS Quincy. Very interesting article in Consortium News, the Khashoggi affair and the future of Saudi Arabia. If Donald Trump seems at a loss about how to respond to the Jamal Khashoggi murder, it may not be because he's worried about his Saudi business investments or any of the other things that Democrats like to bring up to avoid talking about more serious topics. Rather, it's likely because Trump may be facing one of the biggest US foreign policy crises since the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. At that time, the US counted on support from Arab Gulf states no less frightened by the Iranian Revolution. That included Saddam Hussein's Iraq, oil emirates Kuwait and Qatar, plus the Saudis themselves. But if the Saudi power structure were ever to crumble in the wake of the Khashoggi scandal, there would likely be chaos because there is no alternative to replace it. The consequences in terms of US imperial interests would be nearly incalculable. For decades, America has used the Gulf to shape and direct its interests in the larger Eurasian economy. Thanks to trillions of dollars in military investment, the Saudis control the spigot through which roughly 24% of the world's daily oil supply flows, much of it bound for such economic powerhouses as India, China, South Korea, and Japan. Should control pass to someone else, America would find its monopoly severely impaired. The effects would also be felt in Syria, where Israel is incensed by the Iranian presence. It would be even more so should the Saudi counterweight be removed. However, the kingdom may be less stable than it appears. This is the point I made last year. It was already in trouble when MBS began his rise in early 2015. The second generation of Al Saud rulers appeared played out along with their economic model. Talking about MBS began grabbing the reins and issuing orders. The results have been disastrous. Within weeks of being named Minister of Defense, his appointment as Crown Prince would take a few months longer. MBS launched an air war on Yemen that would soon turn into a classic quagmire, one that would cause as many as 50,000 combat deaths, propel much of the country to the brink of starvation, and generate annual costs back home of $50 billion or more that the kingdom could no longer afford. He quarantined Qatar on the grounds of excessive cordiality with Iran and too close relations with the Muslim Brotherhood. He was taken aback when the Emirates showed that it could carry on despite the blockade. A few months later, MBS's henchmen kidnapped Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri and forced him to read a resignation speech on Saudi TV. But Hariri repudiated the speech as soon as he was back in Lebanon. Every attempt to assert Saudi strength only underscored its growing weakness. Bin Salman rounded up 200 of the kingdom's richest princes and businessmen last November, herded them into the Riyadh Ritz-Carlton, and then, following beatings and torture, forced them to hand over $100 billion or more. Capital flight accelerated as a consequence, while FDI is now off 80% from 2016 levels. Unveiled a series of grandiose vanity projects, an entertainment park twice the size of Disney World, a $500 billion robot city known as Neom, and a tourist park the size of Belgium. He hiked gas prices by 80%, slapped on a 5% sales tax, but then went on a Mary Antoinette-style spending spree, shelling out $550 million for a yacht, the Serene, $450 million for a painting, Salvatore Mundi, and $300 million for a French chateau. Whatever the benefits of austerity, they were promptly undercut. It's a great article, read it in full. Disaffected royals thus demand political change along with angry mullahs, obsessed jihadis, and millions of jobless young people. By flooding Saudi Arabia with oil revenue and high-tech armaments and allowing it to attack whomever it pleases, the US has contributed to an increasingly dangerous build-up of highly combustible forces. Of course, the Shah of Shahs, the revolution, I take you back to Kapuscinski's book, oil kindles extraordinary emotions and hopes, since oil is, above all, a great temptation. It is the temptation of ease, wealth, strength, fortune, power. It is a filthy, foul-smelling liquid that squirts obligingly up into the air and falls back to earth as a rustling shower of money. My article was a 32-year-old wannabe king, and I really addressed all these points that have been addressed in the consortium news. I said he immediately launched an unwinnable war in the Yemen. Assad, with his Russian, Iranian, and Lebanese allies, has resisted the regime changes in Syria. Iraq, which was once firmly in the Saudi camp, is lost and now aligned with Iran completely. Qatar is lost. And I was talking about the existential paranoia in his head, evidenced by how can I communicate with them, talking about the Iranians, while they prepare for the arrival of Al-Mahdi al-Montazar. And that's the Salvatore Mundi as well, as it were. Talking about Saad Hariri, the Ritz-Carlton affair, and I said in all the history books I've read, it's probably wisest to operate on one front, not two, and certainly not three. And I called it an unprecedented moment in the history of the kingdom, and the most perilous moment for the House of Saud that I can recall. Now we've learnt that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's agents attacked a blogger, Ghanem al-Dosari, outside Harrods. And whilst they were attacking him, he was with a friend. They said, "This is London, not Saudi." They said, "F-U-C-K London, and the Queen is our slave." And I wrote on the 15th of October that Saudi Arabia is signalling loud and clear that its wannabe king is simply not tenable. He was already unconscionable, I know. Turkey demands Saudi Arabia reveal who ordered the Khashoggi murder, and I responded by saying this is a known known. Al-Jaber says Iran has been a primary actor for regional instability over the past 50 years. Today, two competing visions for the region. One is darkness and the other is of light. Saudi stands for the latter. Well, Putin, you've got to watch this video, teases Ambassador Bolton. Has your eagle already eaten all the olives, leaving only the arrows? It's a wonderful video. You've got to watch it. The body language was so interesting. Museveni widens the tent. President Museveni is to appoint former members of the opposition as ministers, according to a leak of a cabinet list. The president means to divide the opposition and repair the damage to his reputation caused by the Bobby Wine protests and diffuse them. Bonhams proudly reported a white glove sale, meaning that all the outrage lots sold, but the majority had no reserves. Quite interesting at the prices. You can see the boom and the bust